So, let's get this the right direction. I'd like to tell you a story about these two little pieces of embroidered cloth, which really is a story about Hawaii. This sampler was made by Isabella Chamberlain, the daughter of two missionaries who arrived in the 1820s at the beginning of American involvement with Hawaii. And this one was made by a Hawaiian girl named Maka at a missionary school. By studying these samplers and looking into the lives of their makers, we can learn much about the history of American settlement of Hawaii and the cultural exchange or domination that sowed the seeds in a few generations for the takeover of Hawaii by the United States. First, some background on Hawaii's history. The Hawaiians were Polynesians who are believed to have settled in the Hawaiian Islands around 300 to 500 AD. The first contact with Europeans was with Spanish sailors in the 1600s, but apparently this did not set off any further traffic. What started it all was Captain Cook, who is justly famous for traveling several times around the world, coming upon the islands in 1778. Here he is with a watercolor of one of his two ships. So he sailed into Kealakekua Bay. I do not promise to get all of these Hawaiian names correct. I apologize in advance, but maybe you wouldn't know the difference. It's one of the things I'm working on. And because he happened to arrive during a festival honoring their god Lono, he was thought to be the god Lono, and therefore welcomed with open arms. The sailors spent the next few months being wined, dined, and otherwise entertained by the Hawaiians, including the women, but sadly being louts for whatever reasons, including reasons of feeling culturally superior and probably just being guys released from months of enforced celibacy, they abused their hospitality. Cook, returning on his way home, soon outwore his welcome. Long story short, he and 4 sailors were killed in a skirmish, and that was more or less the end of that for the time being. Before his death, Cook named the islands the Sandwich Islands, after the Earl of Sandwich, who was the Lord of the Admiralty back home. Yes, that Sandwich. European ships started using Hawaii as a stop to get water and other provisions, and probably to end that aforementioned shipboard celibacy. Hawaiian attitudes towards sex were much more permissive than ours, but it's not entirely provable that every encounter was consensual. Russia made a half-hearted but easily thwarted attempt to establish a fort in the 1810s, but it provided us with some good illustrations by the French artist who traveled with them. Also after Cook, King Kamehameha, ruler of the island of Hawaii, was consolidating power. Formerly, each island had had a separate ruler, but using weapons collected as payment from various visiting ships, Kamehameha conquered nearly all the neighboring islands by 1805. In 1819, he died, and his surviving favorite wife abolished the old system of kapu, or taboo, basically their whole previous religion and cultural laws. This created a rare coincidental opportunity for the missionaries who arrived just a few months later. One religion had been abolished and nothing else established in its place. The missionaries arriving in April of 1820, 7 couples and 5 children, thought the Lord was working marvelous things for them. And why suddenly in 1820 did 14 missionaries decide to go to Hawaii? Because of this young Hawaiian man, Opukahaia, Americanized to Henry Ubakaya. Born about 1792 on the island of Hawaii, he saw his parents and brothers slaughtered in one of the battles related to Kamehameha's consolidation of power when he was 10. Several years later, he made his way to an American merchant ship stationed in Hawaii and was taken to Connecticut. After converting to Christianity, he was eager to return home to convert his countrymen, but died of typhus fever in 1818. He had been at a school founded by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, afterwards referred to as the ABCFM, which was in Cornwall, Connecticut. His memoirs, which you see here, were published and impressed quite a few New England Congregationalists with a desire to start a mission in the Sandwich Islands. So the ABCFM, already well established and recruiting, interviewing, and sending missionaries to far-flung heathen lands, decided to establish a mission there. The straight-laced New Englanders were in for a severe culture shock. Living in a climate with year-round warm weather and abundant food on land and in the sea, Hawaiians had little need to develop an agricultural society, though they did plant sweet potato and taro, two of their food staples. Likewise, buildings made of pili grass or leaves or trunk fiber from coconut and sugar cane and banana plants stretched onto wooden frameworks were all that were really needed for shelter. Clothing could be minimal, as protection from cold was not an issue. Archibald Campbell wrote in his account of travels around the world about 1810 that the Hawaiian women wore what we'd probably call a sarong, which was about a yard by 3 yards, wrapped around their lower bodies, and in cooler weather, quote, another piece of cloth about their shoulders. The dress of the men, he said, consists merely of a small girdle made of tapper called the maro, and for ceremonial occasions, he mentions red and yellow feather capes such as this one. Note that it's on a woven ground cloth. I don't know if you can see that. By taper, he meant tapa or kapa, a bark cloth which is beaten rather than woven. It's tapa elsewhere in the Pacific Islands and kapa in Hawaii, I've learned. Here are some examples of some of the men's loincloths collected by Cook's expedition and eventually donated to the British Museum, with some wonderful designs on it. But all this meant that incessant labor was not needed to supply Hawaiians' basic needs. To Yankees, for whom idle hands were the devil's playthings, what they called indolence was sinful. Houses without furniture or privacy and bodies without clothing also offended them. So did the lax sexual mores, poor hygiene as they saw it, and practices that admittedly included some incest and infanticide. So let's study the samplers, and I'll weave in more about the interaction of these two cultures. I'll start with Isabella's. She made this in her 11th year, as a nearly invisible inscription says. It says, in her 11th year, in very pale thread there. You can see it better later when you see the sampler. Here she is in her later schoolgirl days. Her father, Levi, came out with the second ship of missionaries in 1823 to be its secular agent. Someone had to run operations, and he was an able accountant originally from Vermont. He was the mission's only bachelor. In 1828, he wrote to the head of the mission in Boston almost apologetically that, quote, it was your opinion when I left America that I should be more useful and quite as happy without a wife. I have tried the experiment for 5 years. But he explained that with a wife, quote, I shall enjoy the sweets of a friendship, which will more than make amends for the solicitudes and anxieties which will be occasioned by the increase of objects of attention. He wrote this because when 4 single ladies had recently disembarked from the third ship, he had courted one, Maria Patton of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and his letter announced that he had married her 5 months later. The Chamberlains had 7 increases of objects of attention, aka children, who reached adulthood. Mariah's diary refers to an additional child who died in infancy. Here are some more photos of the girls and of Everts, who was named after the ABCFM secretary back home. Now, it may seem odd to discuss architecture, but bear with me. The ABCFM arranged for a New England frame house to be shipped around Cape Horn and reassembled in Hawaii, with arriving shortly after the first ship of missionaries. It's got small windows to keep out the cold, and a steep roof to let snow fall off it. But some years later, this porch was added for some protection from the sun. In 1831, Levi Chamberlain built this to be the depository or storeroom for the mission. All supplies went through him, and to be a larger home for his growing family. This was made of blocks carved out of the coral reef by Hawaiians contracted for the job and dried in the sun before being built like a stone or brick house. Instead of protection from cold, this needed protection from heat. It looks like a New England house, but the materials are local and it's planned to better fit into its environment. My point is that although they brought their culture with them and tried to replicate it, they had to make some concessions to their setting. Inside the house, and granted this is a museum display from the 1920s, so we can't be sure how accurate it is in its arrangement, but it is using furniture owned by early missionaries. It looks like an American interior, except for fewer rugs and curtains, which after all are needed to help insulate cold houses back home. They were trying to replicate their culture in a heathen land, and absolutely to shield their children from picking up any aspects of Hawaiian culture. Letters tell how they try to prevent children's learning the Hawaiian language or interacting with the Hawaiians. In 1830, Maria Chamberlain wrote to her sister Isabella, "This is a sad place to bring up children. So many heathenish customs, lewd words, and unbecoming gestures are used by natives that it is exceedingly difficult to keep our little ones from being corrupted by them." Yes, quite difficult when they've hired Hawaiians as servants and they're surrounded by people whose land they've settled in. Basically, the missionaries had a problem. They wanted to spend all their time teaching, preaching, and converting, but they kept having all these darn children who needed to be supervised and taught American culture and values as well as a school curriculum. Ideally, most of them would grow up to continue in missionary work. But there were only the missionary schools, which were educating Hawaiian children, not what American children needed, certainly not the Greek and Latin the boys would need. And trying to homeschool took valuable time, which they wanted to spend on the Hawaiians. Maria wrote a missionary friend in 1836 about, quote, "our trials, constant interruptions, disadvantages for pursuing for any length of time a systematic course of instruction." So sadly, the solution was to send the children all the way back to the States. 5,000 miles, 5 or 6 months' journey, turbulent seas, small ships. Isabella's future brother-in-law, Henry Lyman, wrote a memoir in which he lamented that, quote, lamented the trials of the parents, confiding their darlings to the care of rough sea captains for a voyage of 6 months, little girls having been sent without mother or female companion, torn shrieking from their mother's arms, the wailing infants were hurried away and sent to live among strangers in order to preserve them from contaminating contact with Hawaiians. Their souls were saved, no doubt, but at what an expensive feeling. The poor mothers' hearts were simply broken. Maria wrote bravely to her sister in December 1836 about her 2 eldest sons. "We have a favorable opportunity of sending them into the care of Reverend Samuel Parker, who has been exploring the Oregon territory to prepare for missionaries to go among the Indians." Hawaii was a stopover between Oregon and home, which is a little out of the way, but never mind. "It is extremely painful to part with them at their tender age." Warren was 7.5, Everts was almost 6. "But we feel convinced that it is our duty to send them early away from this polluted land. We cast them with confidence on the care of God." But in a later letter, she admitted, "Many, many tears I shed on account of the early separation. We felt we were seeking to promote their best good by sending them from this land." She hoped to hear from them 13 months after their departure, by which time, who knew if they were still okay or even alive? So the same year Maria sent the boys stateside, there were at least 60 missionary children. Discussions began about starting a school for them. The Hawaiian governor gave some land just outside Honolulu, and in 1841, the Punahou School opened its doors with 15 students, including 3 of the older Chamberlains. Punahou School still exists, and one famous, more recent graduate lives in Washington today. The teachers at the school who might have taught sewing are listed in the ABCFM annual reports for 1849 as Miss Marcia Smith, Mary Sophia Rice, and Mrs. Dole, the second wife of the principal of the school. Don't they all look like fun? Good times. Actually, the centennial history of the school has a lot of quotes from a lot of journals and memoirs from the early students, and they do relate having a lot of fun and doing a lot of swimming and a lot more fun, but I don't think sewing class was that much fun. Let's see. So, okay. Well, here is a class picture that is a little out of place, but there's Isabella and her 2 sisters who preceded her at the school. And here's a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Dole around the time, closer to the time that Isabella would have been there. And yes, I do mean that Dole, but more on that later. So there's where I was supposed to. Isabella's older sisters, Maddie and Mariah, seen in this oval picture, preceded her at Punahou, as did her brothers James and Levi. As the youngest, Isabella joined them in 1844, just before she turned 6, and attended through 1858 when she was nearly 20. Besides sewing, girls were taught a proper curriculum. In 1849, Martha Chamberlain listed classes in Virgil, astronomy, geography, arithmetic, and English grammar and spelling. We also know there was history, botany, and some others. I suspect this may be a class photo, but whether taken at school or not, it's certainly Isabella with other missionary children who almost certainly attended Punahou. In fact, I've been able to confirm a few more of them in the recent day or two. Isabella won a spelling competition in 1850, and in about 1853 she was described by the principal as a bright-eyed, smiling lass, full of good humor as a sunny day, and quite as pleasant to enjoy. The sampler itself is a fairly typical one. The letters and numbers are done in silk on a linen ground, all in cross-stitch. The flowers in the border, however, are wool. Using wool was an incoming trend around this time. The sampler tradition was starting a decline about now back in the States, as was the teaching of sewing skills generally. Cruder samplers done in wool, sometimes on punched paper, or coarser, easier canvas are an incoming trend. You can see there are blue threads over there on the left, blue threads in between here, to guide the student to keep on the right line. Isabella's isn't crude at all, but I think it's interesting she's using wool for the decorative elements, a sort of foreshadowing of Berlin work, or what we call needlepoint, which is the incoming trend at mid-century. Look closely at her border, and you see it's not cross-stitch, but little single diagonal stitches typical of Berlin work. The sampler isn't decorative enough to have details which would place it in any regional style. It falls in a middle ground between the extremely basic first samplers a very young girl would work on like these, and more accomplished decorative ones like these. Both her sampler and Maka's have alphabets plus a short inscription, like many others done in America. Possibly both went on to do something more decorative, though it's more likely that Isabella might have than that Maka did. I think it's important when looking at samplers or quilts to look beyond the object and type of object to what other needlework and crafts were being done by the maker. We know Mariah Chamberlain and her sisters exchanged quilts over the years. One letter mentions a 9-patch quilt sent by her sister to Hawaii. This one here was made probably by a member of the Ruggles family, more early missionaries, said to be made out of silks brought to Hawaii in the 1820s. I can't talk about textiles in Hawaii without mentioning Hawaiian quilts. Americans brought their quilting traditions with them, and surely some of these popular mid-century designs were an influence, but the Hawaiians took them in a whole new direction. Similarly, somebody's Indian or European copy of an Indian shawl inspired this design on a kapa. So I can't help taking a brief detour to show these examples of textiles reflecting cultural exchange. So anyway, quilting Chamberlains. When Isabella's mother returned to Pennsylvania to visit her family in the late 1850s, she wrote home about taking skirts in her wardrobe and adding filling and backing and quilting them to make petticoats. After 30-some years in Hawaii, she was probably pretty cold at home, but she mostly talks about what a joy it was to sit around a quilting frame with her 2 sisters, whom she'd not seen in so long. We also see in her probate inventory a shellwork picture that said "Mother" on it. How Victorian can you get? These are often called sailors' valentines, but there's a long history going back to the 16th century for gentry women to make artwork out of shells. The most extreme examples are shellwork grottos like this one made by Sarah Lennox, who was the subject of the BBC series The Aristocrats, not to be confused with Disney's Aristocats. In the 1840s, Mariah wrote home saying that one of her older girls wanted to send shells from Hawaii back to her American cousins to work with. So these examples of craft in the Chamberlain family put the sampler in context of a longer and broader tradition of women's handiwork. As for historical context, the sampler was done at an interesting time in both Isabella's personal history and Hawaii's. It was done in her 11th year, or when she was 10, which she turned in November of 1848. That very month, a succession of epidemics of measles, whooping cough, and then influenza began to ravage the Hawaiian Islands. Estimates are that at least 1/10 of the Hawaiian population died. The white population was not completely spared. Many young and old, less able to withstand disease, also died. But of course, we're talking about diseases that Europeans had more resistance to generally, so it took its toll more on the Hawaiians. Punahou School closed down for several weeks at the height of the epidemic, which began to die down in March 1849. So it seems likely that Isabella was working on her sampler a little bit later, perhaps in the spring of 1849. Also notable that year was the illness and death of her father. Levi had suffered ill health for years and had taken several sea voyages to try to recuperate, although why being on a sea ship rather than being in the nice climate of Hawaii, I don't get it, but whatever. Anyway, he died on July 29th after failing for several months. Isabella and her siblings were day students, so they saw their sick father daily. I wonder whether her inscription, "The Lord is my shepherd," was chosen because it's from the 23rd Psalm, so universally read at funerals because of the verse, "Lo, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me." This would refer mostly to her father, but perhaps she could have been thinking too of the recent epidemic. I think it's also possible that this could have been completed at home rather than at school. I haven't yet found any documentation of teaching of sewing at the school, but I haven't exhausted that avenue yet. Lastly, the sampler was done just shortly after a major shift in Hawaiian law was enacted, which had huge impact on the islanders' culture and history. King Kamehameha III signed an act called the Great Mahele, or land distribution. A simplified explanation is that whereas the king had previously owned all the land, he now divided it, so the crown owned 1/3, the government owned 1/3, and the people owned 1/3. In effect, this allowed private ownership of land. 2 years later, the Colonial Act of 1850 allowed Hawaiians to apply for title to the land they were farming, but it was prohibitively expensive. So the Europeans and Americans pounced, grabbing land like mad. The effects of the Great Mahele would not be immediately evident, but it's interesting that the sampler was done at this pivotal point in Hawaiian history. So what of Isabella's later life? In 1861, at age 23, she married Frederick Lyman, son of missionaries who arrived in 1831 in the 5th delegation. Frederick and his brothers also attended Punahou and overlapped with Isabella. They certainly knew each other in childhood. Missionary society was small. Frederick's brother Henry's memoir tells of Isabella's father meeting him at the dock when they came from their home on the island of Hawaii to attend Punahou. And also he mentions visiting the Chamberlains in what was to him an impressively spacious house, the Coral one. The Lymans had founded the Hilo boarding school in 1836. Like Isabella's childhood home, their house is now an AAM accredited museum. It focuses on Hawaiian natural history and native culture. Isabella and Frederick had a livestock ranch in the southern part of the island of Hawaii, not far from Hilo. In 1865, they hosted Mark Twain, who toured Hawaii and wrote about his experiences for a San Francisco paper, which were later published as a book. I didn't even touch anything, I swear. Figure this out. Frederick wrote of Twain and a traveling companion that, quote, "They enjoyed the supper very much. After supper," thank you, Katie, "they laid themselves out to entertain us, especially Mr. Clemens with his slow, drawling way. He kept us in roars of laughter." In 1868, a major earthquake occurring just offshore and its resulting tsunami destroyed the Lyman's home and many others, including entire villages. This is still the largest Hawaiian quake in modern history. Frederick's accounts of the earthquake and Isabella's and her mother-in-law's diary of volcanic and earthquake activity in the area are still used by the U.S. Geological Survey. The Lymans moved to Hilo and Frederick to Hilo and eventually to Honolulu, where Frederick eventually became secretary to 2 of the princesses of the Kingdom of Hawaii. Isabella had 6 children. Their son Levi, named for her father, became head of the high-low school his grandparents had headed earlier. Isabella died in 1901, a few years after Hawaii was taken over by the U.S. as a territory. Her lifetime, combined with her parents' time in Hawaii, spanned 80 years from the earliest settlement by American missionaries to the island's takeover by their children and grandchildren, about which more later. So now Maka's sampler. This is a small, simple marking sampler with just 3 stitches. Cross stitch, which is most of the inscription, rice stitch in the first, larger alphabet, and though it's hard to tell with such loose weave and faded thread, star stitch creating the borders. This was done at the Wailuku Female Seminary on the island of Maui, which was the first of a series of boarding schools set up to educate and hopefully convert the Hawaiian children. The missionaries reported everything back home to the ABCFM, so we have a student list from 1841, the year of the sampler. These were also printed at the neighboring boys' school at Lahaina Luna, where the first printing press west of the Rockies, as a historic plaque now says, was established. Literally millions of pages were printed here. The first Hawaiian English dictionaries, the Bible translated into Hawaiian, the first Hawaiian newspapers, and many others. And at the top is a drawing of the school by Edward Bailey, the teacher that I mentioned before, or that I guess I'm about to mention, engraved by one of the Lahaina Luna boys. So 2 girls had names beginning with Maka. You can see she's running out of space on the line there to say her whole name at the bottom. So she just puts Maka. There was Maka Ulia from Honouala on the southwest coast, where you see the yellow arrow and that whole coast. It says the name of that region there along the coast. And there was also Makalio from Waikapu, circled in red right near Wailuku. Wailuku is where the seminary is, and that's circled in yellow. Now, on a modern map, you can see that Waikapu is very, very close to Wailuku, which is where the school was. And one building of the school is now the Maui Historical Society, and they've been very helpful in giving me some information. And this map is another one engraved by the boys at Lahaina Luna. So the school opened in July of 1837, after some misunderstanding about approval of the project. Reverend Jonathan Green, the first principal, wrote a sort of sorry not sorry letter to the ABCFM in October. The suggestion in your letter of December 1836, a year ago practically, that we should incur no expense for a boarding school at this place until the case had been fully approved, came too late to be fully regarded. At the date of your letter, the walls of our building were nearly up. To the charge of disobedience to orders, we plead not guilty. Oops. Conveniently, it took nearly a year for letters to get back and forth. You can get a lot done before the next letter comes, telling you not to do something. He went on to say, we have now 36 little Hawaiian misses from the age of 10 down to 4 years, and ends up with, what shall we do? Shall we now say to these little girls, go back to your parents and live in ignorance and idleness and filth? We can do no more for you. Our patrons and friends refuse to sustain the school. We cannot think that you will now bid us abandon them. We plan to go forward until we hear from you again in a year. Now about the ignorance, idleness, and filth. This is the unpleasant side of the missionary story. There is no doubt these Americans were well-meaning, but they were bound by their own culture and values and thought their way was the only right and proper way. They saw it as their duty to bring people not only to Christ, but to civilization, which meant basically Anglo-American, Protestant, Victorian mores and lifestyle. Enough idleness. Work for its own sake was godly. There's someone, the Queen in idleness, sorry. And this was supposed to animate, and you were supposed to be able to see the thing without the naked lady surfing. Oh well. Surfing, for example, bothered the heck out of them. Here's that lady making kapa cloth in the part you can't see, but elsewhere in the picture you see a surfboard. Surfing offended the missionaries because it was idle, it was done naked. I'm thinking that loincloth is a concession to European viewers. And it was done naked, co-ed, sorry. So what's not to like? Co-ed naked surfing, right? I mean, what's not to deplore? So they did their best to suppress the sport, but happily they were unsuccessful in the long run. But this is one of the examples where they just felt they had to stamp out Hawaiian culture that they just found offensive. I could give you many quotes of missionaries being judgmental about Hawaiian culture, which now would make us squirm, but I think I've given you a taste. They thought boarding schools were the best way to separate the younger generation from the contaminating influences of heathen society and train them in industry, manners, and so on. To quote Sheldon Dibble, a teacher at Lahaina Luna, boarding schools were needed, quote, to take a class of young females away to train them to habits of industry, neatness, and order, to instruct them in employments suited to their sex, to cultivate their minds, improve their manners, and instill the principles of religion, and fit them to be suitable companions for the scholars of the mission seminary, and examples of propriety among the females of the Sandwich Islands. Dibble's school, the Lahaina Luna Seminary, still in operation as a public high school, in fact, was founded several years earlier than Wailuku. Missionaries soon realized that Christian Hawaiian boys would need good Christian Hawaiian girls to marry. So it's not really out of any feminist ideal of female education that the girls' schools were founded. It was really to provide good wives for the converted boys. Now back home, samplers were practical tools to teach girls rudiments of sewing and marking the many, many household linens and items of clothing in a family. But they were also used to teach quiet behavior, industry, concentration, docility, all the female virtues. Hawaiians didn't have many things that needed marking, but samplers would still be a useful part of indoctrination into female virtues and Anglo-American Victorian culture. We know that sampler making was also taught at other mission schools stateside. Here's one done in Mississippi by a Choctaw girl named after a patron of the mission there, Christine Baker. And this was done at a mission school in Valleytown in the Cherokee Nation in North Carolina by a Cherokee girl apparently renamed Eliza Baynard, again after a Baltimore patron of the school. We don't even know her real name. By the way, you may like to know, especially if you missed Kim Ivy's recent lecture at MESDA on their missionary sampler, that Bill Subjack, the dealer who sold us these samplers, has done a lot of research on missionary samplers and will be giving a lecture on them next month at the Schwenkfelder Textile Forum. So if you're interested, ask me about that. Anyway, there's even a large group, this was done by a girl who was like Isabella, not living there because her father was a missionary and the blacksmith, and so she was doing a sampler at the same time that the Native American girl was. There's even a large group of samplers made by African girls in Sierra Leone. Two have the phrase liberated African, which may mean she was saved from slave traders. Again, we see the English name erasing her African identity. Missionaries doubtless brought sampler making to every mission around the world, as it played such an important part in their own culture in indoctrinating girls into quiet, useful work. Maka's sampler ended up in Oregon, almost certainly having been sent to ABCFM missionaries there to show what could be accomplished in missionary schools. Remember, the Chamberlain boys were sent home with a minister who'd just been in Oregon preparing for a mission there. The Hawaiian mission records are full of reports of missionaries going between Oregon and Hawaii. By 1849, the mission's annual report suggested making Punahou school college level, saying that even Californian and Oregonian students, children of missionaries, could find this convenient. So Oregon was much closer on the map and in their minds than we might think. There are two other samplers surviving from Wailuku, both from 1844, 3 years later than Maka's. There were other girls' boarding schools on other islands, which we can guess made samplers too, but these are all that survive. All three use the Hawaiian alphabet as transcribed by the missionaries, with only 12 letters, and their inscriptions are also in Hawaiian. This one was done by Loka, whose school lists tell us was from nearby Waikapu. Kula means school, and Nui has various meanings, including to be great or very, so Kula Nui Wailuku might loosely be translated as praising her great school Wailuku. Once again, there are two candidates for Hannah's identity. Hannah 1 and Hannah 2 are listed in the school roster, both from neighboring islands, which shows you that they were able to draw students from further away. The verse here has been translated as, I am not sitting, I am going, I have a great desire to seek knowledge. The I am sitting sure seems like a reference to rejecting idleness in favor of seeking academic and religious knowledge and cultural mores. Maka's inscription, Mana ka pu'uhomua kula nui wailuku, has been translated as Wailuku, the school that is a place of refuge. Pu'uhomua is a place of refuge, and Kula is a school. This doesn't account for mana at the beginning, or that nui meaning great, however. Mana has various meanings, including reverence or adoration, or spirit, energy of character. Apeli is just the end of the Hawaiian word for April, which she began before the number 22. So, ia apeli, or apeli ia, that altogether means April. So we might amend the meaning to something like adoration or praise for the great school, the place of refuge that is Wailuku. Apparently Hawaiian does a much better job of concentrating a lot of concept into short words. So refuge from what? From the rest of her culture that her teachers looked down on? Was this her own choice of words? It's hard to know what agency sampler makers had in their inscription choices, let alone in this context of the meeting of different cultures and power relationships. At the same time, at least unlike other missionary samplers we've seen, these use the girls' own native language and names. The meeting of cultures was mostly amicable, but not without its problems. We know that when this first school opened, several girls got sick and some even died. The American Dr. Judd was summoned, and he said that, quote, the change in the habits of the pupils from a roving, active life, romping over the fields and mountains or on the seashore, to a quiet condition within the bounds of the seminary had not been good for them. It's worth noting that Dr. Judd was very respectful of Hawaiian healing traditions. He got his Hawaiian assistants to gather native recipes and treatments so he could record and learn from them. Once again, a complex and not always hostile attitude from the white culture. As a result, the 1840 station report for the school said, we have commenced a system of regular exercise. Weekly excursions are now taken with their teacher to the mountain or seashore, and care is used to keep them much in the open air. They form a company of hearty, happy girls, as fond of a romp and ball playing as ever boarding school girls are in America. Here's a picture from the 1830s of another Hawaiian school supplied with a set of swings. The teachers at Wailuku were the Reverend Jonathan Green and his wife Theodosia, for whom we have no photo, Edward Bailey and his wife Caroline, seen here with their family. It's Edward Bailey whose pictures, both of the engravings and so on that we've seen, and Mariah Ogden, who we know taught sewing and other fiber arts. A Hawaiian named Malahai is listed as a teacher's assistant, but I haven't been able to confirm yet whether that's a man's or a woman's name. Lydia Brown was not a teacher at the school, but she must be mentioned. She arrived at Wailuku in July 1835 before the seminary opened, having been sent to teach, as her 1836 report said, quote, the females on the Sandwich Islands how to manufacture their own cloth. Now, the reasons the missionaries wanted to get cloth manufacture started and the Hawaiian governors and kings' reasons for supporting it differed and are another story altogether. But at any rate, by the end of her first year, Brown had made 90 years of cloth from what the ladies spun, and she also intended to teach just one promising woman to weave. One can weave as much as 6 or 7 can spin, she explained to the men reading the report, who probably didn't know that much about spinning and weaving. A later report noted that her students were now, quote, dressed in garments of their own manufacture. It should be noted, however, that the missionaries' attempts to get all Hawaiians into good Christian clothing was a long-term project. At first, wearing European-style clothing was a status symbol for royal and chief levels of society and only done occasionally. It took a long time to trickle down to the so-called common people. Here are a few Hawaiian ladies in dresses, but the rest are still traditionally clad or not. In 1849, after almost 30 years in Hawaii, the annual report was able to say that great progress had been made only in the last 7 years. Although the Americans congratulated themselves for teaching weaving, the concept was not new to the Hawaiians. Their clothes were of kapa, but they wove mats for their homes and made baskets. So although the machinery used was unfamiliar, the fiber structure was not. This Hawaiian mat shows a reasonably sophisticated combination of weaves. But what was Brown spinning and weaving? It turns out it was cotton. Lydia wrote to young Warren Chamberlain, Isabella's older brother, age 6 at the time, "Remember that while I was with you, you gathered and brought up to me all the cotton you could find, and I told you when my wheels, etc., were set up, I would spin you yarn enough for a pair of stockings." She was sending the yarn and suggested his mother or sisters might knit for him. There's a native Hawaiian cotton plant, it turns out, that grows wild to this day. It seems likely Lydia was urging her students in Wailuku to gather cotton for the purpose back on Oahu as well. Maui. So why do we care about this? Because as it turns out, Maka's sampler is not made of linen, as most samplers are, but of cotton. It's also backed in another layer of cotton, which you can see just underneath the weave of the top. Lydia Brown left Wailuku in 1840, the year before Maka's sampler was made, but she undoubtedly met with Maria Ogden, who arrived in Wailuku in mid-1838 to teach at the newly opened seminary. They probably discussed teaching spinning. They'd certainly have known each other, as two of a very few whites on the island. Ogden was from New Jersey and arrived on the same boat as Maria Patton Chamberlain. The two were fast friends after bonding on the ship journey. Maria Ogden regularly came to help whenever Mrs. Chamberlain was having another baby. Ogden's minister wrote the head of the ABCFM to recommend Ogden in these terms. "She is a single female and an orphan, having no ties of relationship whatever to bind her to home and country. Her piety is fervent, enlightened, and consistent. Her intellect is above mediocrity and has been well cultivated by education. Her manners are gentle and persuasive, but rather reserved. She has a good knowledge of household management and is possessed of the most industrious habits. Health good, age 28, disposition most conciliating, affectionate, and amiable." So many adjectives the Victorians would love in a woman. Gentle, cultivated, industrious, conciliating. Being without a family was a plus. Being single was a bit of a problem. She was one of the first single ladies accepted as a missionary. In fact, many of the missionary boats were full of newlyweds. They'd met as hopeful but single missionaries who needed to be married, practically arranged marriages. It reminds me of Jane Eyre when her cousin St. John wants her to marry him so they can be missionaries together in India. Reverend Green reported that Ogden is a great blessing to the school and is exceeding happy. She has 6 spinning wheels in successful operation. He asked in the same letter whether the mission could send a loom with various accessory parts such as heddles and shuttles. Also, cotton cards, i.e. for carding or aligning the fibers of cotton to ready them for spinning, confirming that cotton is being worked on at the seminary. He also mentions trying to raise silkworms, but that seems not to have gone very far. A loom must have been sent, for Ogden wrote that same year to another missionary, "Our little girls are docile, obedient, and industrious." More Victorian female virtues. "A class of 7 are spinning and will soon have a piece ready for the loom." The 1840 report on the school noted that spinning, knitting, braiding bonnets, and sewing are daily avocations and are performed with great cheerfulness. Braiding bonnets was something New England girls often learned to do, but as we've seen, braiding, twining, and weaving were also native skills. This hat is undated in the museum's database, but it looks close enough to an 1830s or 40s man's hat shape that I used it here. So it seems quite possible that Maka's sampler could be made of some of the cotton woven either in the late 1830s by Lydia Brown, who was turning out yardage at breakneck speed, or by Maria Ogden and her students at the school. It could even be homespun Hawaiian cotton. Unfortunately, as Mary Ballard of the Smithsonian's Textile Conservation Research Lab tells me, once cotton is carded, you can't extract its DNA to find out what species it is, so we can't confirm it with tests. But we can compare Maka's fabric to another typical American sampler on linen and see that Maka's weave is much coarser and more open than you usually see used in samplers. So I would say very plausibly woven at the school. In the early 1840s, Ogden asked Levi Chamberlain for many sewing-related items, including colored sewing silk, which would be needed for samplers, but she never asks for linen. This seems to support the idea that in 1841, the cotton is their own. By 1844, when the other two linen Wailuku samplers are made, Ogden is asking for 6 yards of linen. Perhaps she's no longer weaving cotton at the school, or not enough of it. Or they liked the tighter weave, who knows. Now, what do we know about these girls, or their own feeling about their schooling? It was a custom in Hawaii to foster children with other families, so perhaps it didn't seem too alien to be sent from home, but surely the environment and lifestyle were hard to adjust to. Were they happy? Reports back home spoke of beaming faces and joyful hearts, not a dim eye or sad look to be seen, but then they would. Did the inscriptions reflect a real love of the school, or were they chosen by the teacher? Maria Ogden spoke fondly of the girls, and there are many testimonials to how she was beloved by the students, but these are written by the whites, not the students. There's a rather sad composition by an early Lahaina Luna student called Mistaken Ideas Concerning the Missionaries, which lists misunderstandings by the Hawaiians in the early years. One mistake was, quote, "We thought that God's word would be to be kind, but here we are reviled, called poverty-stricken people, loafers, greedy for possessions. That too was a mistaken impression." That's probably not a reflection of every personal relationship between teachers and students, but it gives a window into how it felt from the Hawaiian side. And what do we know about the girls after their school years? Sadly, nothing. I've only tried tracing Maka. I haven't found student lists after 1841 to see how long she's at the school. There are marriage records starting in the 1820s, some of the only places you'll find women of this era documented. But it's hard to be sure who's who, especially with women without a surname. I looked for a Makaulia or Makalio with variant spellings, marrying in the 1840s or 50s on the island of Maui, where both Makas were from. I found a marriage for a Makaulia, Mary Ann Chapin, named for a missionary stationed at nearby Lahaina. Could our Maka have converted and been given this name by missionaries honoring a former colleague? This would be similar to those Native American and African girls whose samplers we saw. Reverend Green wrote in a fundraising circular that for a certain level of funding, they would name a graduating scholar, if educated and virtuous, after the benefactor. Now, I don't think this is our Maka in this particular record, because both candidates for sampler maker were in the younger classes, and this marriage was just 2 years later. But this illustrates not only the challenge tracing women before the 20th century, but a reminder of the marginalization of Native people in records kept by colonizers everywhere. The later history of Wailuku's seminary reflects Hawaiian history in the second half of the 1800s. The ABC-FM could not support the school, and it closed about 1850. Edward Bailey, who had replaced Reverend Green as the head of the seminary when Green got fed up with the lack of support, and you should read some of the letters, bought the school buildings and started a sugar plantation pictured here in his own painting. The second half of the 1800s saw, as I said earlier, the land grab by non-missionary businessmen and in some cases, former missionaries like Bailey and missionaries' children. By 1893, only 10% of land was owned by Hawaiians. So why are we saying 1893? That's when the United States took over. In 1887, powerful white Hawaiian residents, led, I'm sorry to tell you, by the grandson of some of the early missionaries, forced a new constitution on the king that, surprise, benefited the foreign, mostly American, non-Hawaiian citizen, rich plantation owners and businessmen. When the king's sister, Liliuokalani, succeeded him in 1891, she tried to write a new constitution. Well, people in power don't like having it threatened, and in 1893, the American businessmen prevailed upon the American minister to Hawaii to call in the U.S. Marines, these are Navy people, not Marines, but I couldn't find a picture of the Marines, to protect American interests and basically stage a coup, deposing the Queen, abolishing the monarchy, establishing the Republic of Hawaii with Sanford Dole as territorial governor, yes, that Dole, the son of the Punahou principal, and Frederick Lyman, Isabella's husband, was a delegate to the 1894 convention, which wrote a new constitution. The Queen made this crazy quilt while imprisoned in her palace. The center blocks record her abdication and imprisonment, and it's full of names of the women who stayed with her. Hawaiian flag quilts became a popular motif starting in the 1890s. I wonder why. President Grover Cleveland refused to annex Hawaii initially, but in 1898, as we entered the Spanish-American War in the Pacific, owning Hawaii, where we already had Pearl Harbor, looked critical. So we gained from that war not only Puerto Rico and Guam, but Hawaii. And of course, half a century later, in 1959, Hawaii became our last state. Well, almost exactly 198 years ago today, the first missionaries landed in Hawaii. In 2 years, the bicentennial will be commemorated. The Mission House Museum, from whom I got so many of these documents and pictures, and other sites are already announcing this as a time for reflection and rejuvenation, a tempered phrase which implicitly acknowledges the complexity of the events set in motion in 1820 and the interplay of the two groups, Americans and Hawaiians. Meanwhile, the samplers are here for you to examine today and will be in our upcoming exhibit, which opens with our newly renovated gallery and study gallery